This is Joe Stewart, Vice President for Governmental Affairs, the Independent Insurance Agents of North Carolina. We are getting ready to get started with our post-election summary webinar. We'll give it a few more minutes and let folks get settled in and get underway. We promise to get all of this concluded within an hour. And again, a reminder that there is continuing education credit that you get for viewing this, and we'll explain how that part of it works here in just a minute. So hang tight. We'll give it one more minute, let some more folks get in. Okay, I think we're ready to get underway. Brittany, you want to kick things off for us?
Hey, Joe, yes, I would love to do that. My name's Brittany. I'm going to be in the background. I'm with the professional development team, so I'll be tracking your CE today. And to do that, we're going to be launching a couple of polling questions. So by the state of North Carolina's rules, we launch 2 polling questions per hour. Those are going to be launched randomly. You'll see them pop up in front of your screen. Just go ahead and click yes, you're here, and it'll go away, and then we'll just keep on going. If you have any technical issues, if you have any difficulty responding to a poll, seeing a poll, anything like that, please email us at education@iianc.com so that we can track whether or not you were in attendance. And if you have any difficulties just in general with the webinar, if something freezes up on you, if you aren't able to ask questions, things like that, please go ahead and send us an email at education@iianc.com and we'll take a look at that. We have some team members on standby for any questions that are going to come up. And just speaking of questions, if you would like to ask a question, please drop that in the chat. Joe and myself will kind of be monitoring that chat, and we'll bring those questions up when we need to. And I think that's everything. Joe?
Brittany, thanks so much. Fantastic. Appreciate that. Again, I'm Joe Stewart, Vice President of Governmental Affairs, the Independent Insurance Agents of North Carolina. And we wanted to provide this for our members, a little bit of a summary. In the day after the election, it was a dynamic election, and we learned quite a bit about the nature of not only North Carolina political attitudes, but national political attitudes. And because this is a highly regulated industry, we find it is important to remain knowledgeable about what the political landscape is like, who the key players are in the state legislature, as well as in control of the U.S. House and Senate in Washington, D.C. And so we wanted to take this time and talk a little bit about the election results and what it might tell us about the various things we need to know as we move forward, advocating on your behalf, both in Raleigh and in Washington. First, the turnout in North Carolina was pretty robust, not quite as great as it was in the presidential contest 4 years ago, but a little over 5.6 million of the 7.7 million registered voters in the state took part, a 73% participation rate in the election that included the early voting portion as well as election day. Nearly a full 2/3 of the registered voters turned out in the early in-person voting segment of the election this year. Not quite as many mail-in ballots as we had seen in the 2020 election. Again, that was prompted in large part as a result of COVID, where people didn't want to go out in public to vote. But increasingly, that early voting segment where people go to a community center or other facility, the Board of Elections in their county, and vote, that is increasingly the more popular way for people to vote. And about 1 million of the 5.6 million actually turned out on election day to vote at their local precinct. A couple of takeaways. I think fundamentally what we know now, Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, came up just short of having the alignment of various voter segments that Joe Biden had put together to win the presidency in 2020. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but a relatively unique trajectory into the presidential election contest by the vice president, but just came up a little short in terms of recapturing what Joe Biden was able to put together to win just 4 years ago. In North Carolina, the governor's race, Mark Robinson, for those of you that follow North Carolina politics, as you can see, I put up the polling results from High Point University going back to March of this year, May of this year, and then finally in September. You can see this contest for the governor's office in North Carolina was considered to be one of the top competitive races in the country, and it proved not to be. Some revelations that came out about some conduct of Mr. Robinson and his youth, and it really changed the dynamic there. Mark Robinson became lieutenant governor in winning the primary, 11-person Republican primary for lieutenant governor in 2020. He had just over the 30% threshold to avoid a runoff, won the lieutenant governor's race that year. So, relatively speaking, had not been in the public light much prior to his time in the lieutenant governor's office. And so, to some extent, the things in his background that proved to be problematic in the governor's race would have been probably discovered before now if he had sought public office prior to running for lieutenant governor in 2020. And sometimes a fresh face on the political scene is good, but it does mean that the candidate's untested. And so that's really what came to pass in the governor's race. 3 of the down ballot Council of State Republican candidates, Hal Weatherman, Dan Bishop in the Attorney General's race, and Michelle Morrow, lost their races, and in part because of their connection to Mark Robinson. They had been the 3 of the Republican candidates running for Council of State seats most closely aligned with Robinson. And in large part, that probably contributed, at least in part, to the fact that they were not successful in their efforts in the races in which they were running. We often say that all politics is local, but the race that we thought would make the biggest difference in whether the state house remained in a supermajority for the Republicans, Tricia Cotham, a Democrat elected to the state house who became a Republican during the session this last year, ran in a district that had been redrawn slightly to Republican performance standards, slightly higher than the district she'd been in when she ran as a Democrat. The expectation was that her race would be the one to decide whether or not House Republicans got to 72 seats, and thus having enough Republicans in the House to be able to override a gubernatorial veto on a party line vote. That proved not to be the race. Not to give away, a spoiler alert, it does not appear at this point. Some of the races are still too close to say definitively, but it does not appear that the House Republicans in the General Assembly got to the 72 number that they needed. But it wasn't because of Tricia Cotham. She won her race. And so the question is, we all expected that perhaps flipping from one party to the other might cost Representative Cotham some votes in her own county, but it did not appear to have the impact that a lot of us thought it might. All right, starting at the top of things, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. At this point, there's still a few races that have not been called across the country, but the Republicans do have a majority of the seats in the U.S. Senate, 52 of the 100. And so we'll return to Washington in January of 2025 in control of the U.S. Senate. On the House of Representatives side, still quite a few, about 60 or so across the country that are not yet really decided, so close they can't be determined. May not know for a little bit here whether or not the Republicans or the Democrats control the U.S. House of Representatives. Republicans currently hold it with a very narrow margin. So that may ultimately be where the division in our federal government is between the House and the Senate, and not between the president and the Congress. But we'll have to wait a week or two or so, I would say. And then, of course, Donald Trump won the presidency, securing the necessary 270 electoral college votes, winning what were called the blue wall states in the Midwest that Joe Biden had been successful in winning back in 2020, where Trump had won those in 2016. And so it's still a few states that it's really close, but all of the states where it's not close, where it's definitively been decided, put together enough of the electoral college votes for Donald Trump to win the presidency. It looks like at this point that Donald Trump will also win the popular vote, meaning he secured more votes than Kamala Harris in total. Of course, we know that doesn't matter in the presidency. It's the electoral college that decides who the president is. But we'll have to wait a little while till everything shakes out in some of these states where it was very, very close to see what those numbers end up being in terms of the overall popular vote. All right, moving to North Carolina, the last round of polls, Real Clear Politics on their website aggregates all of the publicly available polling. And as of Monday, it showed Donald Trump up in the polls by about 1.5 points here in North Carolina. And there you see the results from 2020 and 2016. In 2016, Donald Trump won about 3.5 percentage points over Hillary Clinton, and then about 1.5 points over Joe Biden 4 years ago. It looks like his final result here this time is about between those two results. And so there was some speculation that Trump would do about 2 percentage points better in terms of the actual votes than he was showing in the polls. And that's seemingly what came to pass here in these polls that were conducted in North Carolina just before the actual election day. here's the results. Robert F. Kennedy was on the ballot, sued the state of North Carolina to get on the ballot, and then sued the state to get off the ballot when he decided to withdraw from his candidacy for the presidency in support of Donald Trump. But Trump winning 51% of the popular vote here in North Carolina. We had 4 other candidates on the ballot, in addition to the 2 major party candidates, and then about 0.4%, 0.4 of a percentage point, voters wrote in somebody to be president of the United States. In the congressional races, we have 14 districts. There were new maps drawn as a result of the redistricting lawsuits from the maps that were promulgated for the 2022 elections. So we started this with 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans in our congressional delegation. The way the new maps were drawn, the performance was pretty sure for there to be at least 10 Republican districts and at least 3 Democratic districts. The one that was competitive of the 14 was in the 1st district, the northeastern corner of the state. Don Davis, the incumbent, all of the incumbents here are have their name italicized to show you that. And then Lori Buckhout, who had run 2 years ago, but had lost the Republican primary, was the Republican opponent to Davis this time. But Davis was able to win this election. And so our congressional delegation will be 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats. All of the other seats, relatively speaking, the way the districts are drawn based on the historical voting patterns, the partisan preference of voters in that particular part of the state, it was pretty certain which of the party's candidates was going to win these races. And so this is the configuration of the representation to North Carolina to the U.S. House of Representatives. A few notable in the 14th district, you see there on the lower left side, Tim Moore winning his seat. He is the current Speaker of the State House of Representatives and decided to run for Congress and will go there in his first term. Pat Harrigan up there in the 10th district, sort of at the top center, you see had run before and lost in that 2 years ago as a Republican candidate. Slightly different district that he was running in. This time will go as a freshman member. And then Addison McDowell right next to Harrigan, winning in the 6th district, will go and be a freshman as well. And then Brad Knott in the 13th district, also on that top line, will be joining the delegation in his first term. Mark Harris, who had been elected to Congress, and then the election had been invalidated and rerun. And so he will be returning now to the congressional delegation of North Carolina. But this is who our representation in Washington in the U.S. House of Representatives will be starting in January of 2025. Looking at the state legislature, again, the analysis based on historical voting patterns in all of the districts show that voters have a likelihood of voting for candidates of one party or the other based on their historical preferences. And that's the characterization of all of the legislative seats, 120 in the House and 50 in the Senate. The current configuration, there are 30 Republicans in the Senate and 20 Democrats. So that's a supermajority. In other words, Republican advantage sufficient to override a gubernatorial veto on a party line vote. Similarly, in the state house currently, 72 Republicans and 48 Democrats. It looked as though it was pretty clear that the Republicans would maintain their majority status in the General Assembly. The only question was, would they be able to maintain supermajority? And there were a few super competitive races, just a handful, that were very likely to determine that outcome. Again, pretty certain that Republicans would be in the majority. The question would be, with the separation occurring between Josh Stein, the Democratic candidate for governor, and Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate for governor, it appeared in the weeks leading up to Election Day very likely that Stein would win. The question would then be, would the Republicans in the General Assembly have enough members to be able to override any veto of any legislation that Governor Stein had affected? And so, looking first and foremost of the members of the General Assembly that are IIANC members, our agent legislators, we had 6, and 1 decided. John Bradford had run in the Republican primary in a congressional district and had not been successful. So our 5 agent legislators that were up for reelection, looking at how they did, all 5 won. So we're in good shape coming back. And as you can see, their relative influence in both chambers, House and Senate, Chris Humphrey, who's actually an all-state agency owner, but an associate member of IIANC, is a chair of the House Insurance Committee, and Todd Johnson, who's an independent agency owner, is one of the chairs of the Senate Insurance and Commerce and Insurance Committee. So we're in great shape. Kevin Corbin and Jim Bergen in the Senate are two of the chairs of the Senate Healthcare Committee, and Senator Vicky Sawyer is a chair of transportation. We're in great shape. And fortunately, even though Representative Bradford did not come back to the General Assembly, he has graciously accepted an invitation to serve as chair of the IIANC Governmental Affairs Committee for the coming year. So we'll have the benefit of his expertise and knowledge and relationships within the General Assembly, helping guide our legislative agenda. So we are in really good shape heading into the 2025 session of the General Assembly. All right, so looking at the Senate, there were 3 races that were considered. The Senate had to win 2 of the 3 to maintain the 30 seats for the supermajority, and they won all 3, even though the one district and the chart there that you see shows what the partisan shifts are among the voters in those districts. So even though the district may favor a Democrat or Republican right now, the trend line is important. So I included that in the chart to give you some sense. But these 3 races were considered key. The Senate Republicans needed to win 2 of the 3. They won 3. The one in the Granville County, Wake County area, Senate District 18 there, very close margins, just a handful of votes separating the 2 candidates. But the Republican candidate at this point is the winner, although it probably will go to a recount. It's that close, double digits in terms of the number of votes that separate the 2 candidates. The only other race that's close enough to be go to a recount is in Mecklenburg County, and this was an open seat race. Again, as you can tell from the result totals, very, very close there. But so the answer to the question is that the Senate Republicans will maintain their supermajority starting with the legislative session in January of 2025. On the House side, several more of these districts that were competitive and in play. The House had lost 2 of these in Republican incumbents, so they have lost their supermajority by 2. But then there was a surprise Republican win in Cabarrus County in a district where a Democratic incumbent was defeated by a Republican challenger. So the House has now come up 1 vote short, at least at this point. Again, it's not, none of the votes are final, of course, until it's all been certified by the state. But some of these votes in the recount are close enough that it could change these numbers. But the Republicans are not at supermajority levels at this point in the House, although it's very close. And there might always be the possibility of Republicans able to convince a Democrat to vote with them in a veto override given a particular issue, or as was the case with Representative Cotham, maybe one of the Republicans is willing to even consider switching their partisan affiliation and becoming a Republican to give the House Republicans the supermajority. But at this point, it does not look as though the General Assembly will be able to override any vetoes by Governor Stein, which creates a far greater level of impasse between the governor and the legislature as we start to think about what public policy issues will be taken up next year in the General Assembly. Going into this election, as we talked about before earlier, Stein and Robinson have been very close. The separation was pretty considerable in the final weeks leading up to the election as the revelations about some of the things in Mark Robinson's background were coming out in public. Most of the political consultants on both sides of the aisle that I talked to felt as though even though the separation in the polling was approaching 15%, it seemed highly unlikely that the final result was any more than maybe 4 to 7%. But it turned out that polling was correct in that regard. Josh Stein winning by nearly 14 percentage points, a 5 percentage point victory in a statewide race in North Carolina would be considered a landslide. So this is a pretty considerable separation. One thing of note, the Libertarian candidate there in the governor's race, Ross, you could see he only got 3.5, almost 3.2%. That would be a very large turnout of Libertarians. And I think some of the bleed off of votes, Republican voters that might have supported Mark Robinson otherwise chose not to because of these things that had come out about him. So just chose to vote for the Libertarian. So you see that result was slightly higher than Libertarian candidates for governor have historically enjoyed. Rachel Hunt, a current state senator and daughter of former Governor Jim Hunt, winning the lieutenant governor's race. Hal Weatherman, one of those 3 Republicans that I mentioned, was very closely aligned with Mark Robinson. And so to some extent probably is at least some part of the reason why Weatherman fell to Rachel Hunt in the lieutenant governor's race. The rest of the Council of State, Elaine Marshall, longtime Secretary of State, winning there, somewhat closer than you might otherwise have expected for such a long-term incumbent, but she did prevail in that race. The auditor's race was kind of an open seat race. Jessica Holmes had been appointed to replace Democratic incumbent Beth Wood, had resigned the seat. And so even though Holmes was serving as auditor, she had never run for auditor prior to this. So not quite like an incumbent, but was in effect technically the incumbent, I guess. But Dave Bullock, the Republican challenger, winning there. That's one of the few of the down ballot Council of State races that also had a Libertarian candidate. You see, he pulled about 3 percentage points there. But the Republican winning auditor, also in the state treasurer's race, Dave Briner, who's currently on the UNC Board of Visitors, beating Wesley Harris, a member of the State House of Representatives in the state treasurer's race. Michelle Morrow, who defeated the Republican incumbent superintendent of public instruction, Catherine Truitt, lost to Mo Green, former executive with the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation and former public school system superintendent. Again, Morrow, one of those 3 Republicans most closely aligned with Mark Robinson, probably does explain, at least in part, her loss in that race. In the Attorney General's race, Jeff Jackson, a member of Congress, former state senator, Dan Bishop, also a member of Congress, former state senator and House member. There, Jackson winning. There hasn't been a Republican attorney general since the 19th century. I think it goes back quite a ways, but Jackson, a prolific figure on social media, using TikTok quite a bit. But again, I think in part, Dan Bishop's alignment with Mark Robinson probably also explains that loss a little bit. Steve Troxler, longtime incumbent agriculture commissioner, winning handily in that race, also a Libertarian candidate there. Open seat race for labor commissioner, Luke Farley beating Braxton Winston, the Democrat there. And in the race, probably of most interest to the constituency watching this, Mike Causey, the incumbent insurance commissioner, winning a 3rd term in that office, defeating State Senator Natasha Marcus of Mecklenburg County. And so Commissioner Causey will be the insurance commissioner once again, starting in January of 2025. All right, going back and looking at all of the Council of State going back to 2000 and the party of the incumbents, you can see the darker line there between 2012 and 2016 is when the state ended the practice of what was called straight ticket voting. The voters had the option of pulling one lever and voting for all of the candidates of one party or the other. And once that was done away with in North Carolina, you see there was a lot more going back and forth in these various Council of State seats. And so Democrats and Republicans occupying more different Council of State positions than had historically been the practice. And you can see the results from 2024. We had a Democratic governor. We have a Democratic governor in Roy Cooper. We will have a Democratic governor in Josh Stein. We have a Republican lieutenant governor. We will have a Democratic lieutenant governor. You can see that the reason this is important, of the 10 Council of State, governor, lieutenant governor, and 8 other statewide executive branch elected offices, in the aftermath of COVID, the General Assembly enacted provisions that made some of the emergency actions that are taken by the executive branch, which were historically reserved exclusively for the governor. The governor made the decisions about a lot of this stuff. There's now a requirement for many of these things to be voted on by all 10 members. So it's a 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans in these Council of State seats. But again, voters recognizing in some extent, I think for Steve Troxler in agriculture and Elaine Marshall, Secretary of State, and Mike Causey, an insurance commissioner, some benefit from being incumbents, just slightly greater name recognition among voters who don't know that much about these candidates. That probably made a difference in these races. So we'll have a lot of new faces. All the asterisks there you see will be new in their offices starting in January of 2025. We were very aggressive in providing information to our members throughout the election season, particularly about the candidates running for insurance commissioner, both in the primary, and there were contested primaries, both the Democrat and Republican side. We did interviews with all of the candidates running in the primary, and then both of the candidates running in the general election, Commissioner Causey and Senator Marcus. At the end of the day, the Governmental Affairs Committee decided to support Commissioner Causey with a contribution from our Political Action Committee. And our Independent Expenditure Committee made the decision to support Commissioner Causey's reelection campaign with some express advocacy. The ads that we ran, digital ads, you can see there's an example of that on the screen, social media placements, principally to help support Commissioner Causey. And again, he was successful in his reelection. We made the decision. Commissioner Causey had been very good to work with on issues that mattered to the independent agent community. He had an open door policy, was willing to sit down and talk about issues that arose. He was very supportive of our issues of interest, such as distracted driving and trying to enact a hands-free driving law in North Carolina. And so the decision there to support his reelection campaign, and he was successful. So we look forward to working with Commissioner Causey going forward. Also on the ballot were statewide judicial races, 1 state Supreme Court race, and 3 Court of Appeals races. In the again, to make it even more complicated, Allison Riggs was on the Court of Appeals, was appointed to the Supreme Court seat that was vacated by Mike Morgan, the Democrat, who decided to resign his Supreme Court seat to run in the Democratic primary for governor against Josh Stein. So Riggs ran as an incumbent, even though she'd never run for the state Supreme Court before. She had run for the Court of Appeals, which is also a statewide race, but came up just a bit short in that race, very close, and this may go to a recount as well. And then in the 3 appeals court race, Carolyn Thompson was appointed to fill the seat vacated by Allison Riggs when Justice Riggs was elevated to the Supreme Court, just to make it as complicated as possible. But all 3 Republican candidates won, 2 incumbents, 1 incumbent and 2 first-time candidates for those seats. So you could see on the 7 seats on the state Supreme Court, it will now be 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And in the 15 seats on the Court of Appeals, it'll be 12 Republicans and 3 Democrats. These races don't get a lot of attention. Republican candidates in these judicial contests have done very well over the last several election cycles. Some speculation that voters are generally more inclined to support a Republican candidate running for a judicial position, believing they would be tough on crime or more stringent on matters that come before them as a jurist. To some extent, judges have a hard time running for office. There are limitations. The Judicial Code of Conduct does not allow a candidate for any judgeship, either at the state level or local level, to talk about any public policy issue that might come before them as a matter of law. And so it's very difficult for the candidates to talk about what their position is on any particular issue. But Republicans have typically done pretty well in these seats over the last couple of years. Now, looking at a little bit of the macro issues that came up in this election, I thought it would be a good opportunity to kind of reflect on this. There were a lot of unusual features about this particular presidential contest, not the least of which you have a former president running again. The last time an incumbent president who lost re-election came back and won again was Grover Cleveland. So Donald Trump and Grover Cleveland are the only 2 American presidents now to have pulled off having lost and then coming back and win again. The way that the vice president came onto the ticket was very unusual. Joe Biden, the incumbent, was the presumptive nominee, made the decision after disastrously bad debate performance to withdraw in favor of Kamala Harris. Harris went on to secure the nomination, but had a very short period of time to try to put together a significant effort to undo the lack of enthusiasm among a lot of the Democratic base for Joe Biden's reelection campaign. And probably when we've had a little more time and could do a little bit more assessment, look at a little bit more of the exit polling data that has been conducted by various media outlets, we'll find Harris did a great job coming back or coming up to just about where she needed to be to win. Maybe it was just there wasn't enough time, or she just wasn't well enough known among voter segments, or some other set of factors that took place. But it was a very unusual, atypical presidential election in American history. The question is, with all of this, and again, it's a very difficult time in American politics. People feel very strongly about their support for and opposition to candidates and are really entrenched on the issues. The question is, what kinds of political leaders will emerge now? Will we see more people with a background in celebrity and entertainment? Just those are people well known to Americans, better known in many ways. That explains Donald Trump's rise in politics. He had been on television and been a feature in American popular culture for many years before running for president in 2016. And so we may see more people coming out of the entertainment industry seeking public office. I think one of the things that was true about this race is younger voters in particular, prior to President Biden dropping out of the election, expressed a lot of frustration that both of the candidates were old, that they didn't feel relatable to younger voters. Kamala Harris benefited a little bit when Biden dropped out in that she was at least younger. She's not that young at all. She's my age, so she's not really young as far as that goes. It'll be interesting to see if younger people in the aftermath of this election start to demand more of their own as candidates. They want to see more young people, thus more relatable from a generational standpoint, seeking public office. Some of the interesting things that were in place at this election cycle, a significant lowering of the number of people, self-identified Democrats and Republicans, who said they would even consider voting for a candidate of the other party. Low single digits in the public opinion research that I saw. A lot of people that expressed that the reason they were supporting a particular candidate was really to express their opposition to the other party's candidate. We still maintain a relatively high voter turnout. As we said before, 73% in this election, about 75.5% from 4 years ago. But we've seen some steady increases. Not entirely sure why that is, other than perhaps the internet and social media makes it easier for voters to get information about the election and be informed and feel engaged in a way that maybe they weren't all able to feel before in the pre-internet era. But looking at the voter attitudes, people were very sour about the economy, even though most economists would say things are pretty good in terms of the American economy as it is currently. People were not feeling that and expressed a lot of that frustration when asked the question, what are the issues that you consider most important to be addressed by the candidate that you're selecting to be your president? And so while both candidates were not necessarily held in very favorable light by even their own party's voters, generally speaking, I think what benefited Donald Trump, at least in part, was the perception that on an economic issues basis, he would be better for people than Kamala Harris. And that probably helped a little bit. The question coming out of this election too, well, the classic definition of what it means to be a Democrat and Republican change is ideologic rigidity within the two parties has become the more common feature. There's not as much wiggle room. And this was the first presidential election in North Carolina where unaffiliated registered voters were a plurality of the registered voters. And so we may see some change in the way voters perceive what it means to be identified with one party or the other. Will there be another party that emerges? I'm not sure that will happen, but I think people will think of their identity as either a Democrat or Republican in a different way going forward. What were the issues? It appeared strongly, particularly among voters that had supported Donald Trump, at least looking at some of the exit polling data, the economy, a general sense of crime, and the issues of immigration and the southern border were motivating those voters. They felt very strongly about those issues and felt Donald Trump was the candidate they felt most confident would be able to address those issues. The issue of abortion was leveraged quite frequently by Democratic candidates. It didn't prove to have quite the impact in turning out additional, particularly younger female voters that I think the Harris campaign had hoped for. There were a number of ballot initiatives across the country involving reproductive rights, most of which passed. It lost in, I think, Nebraska and Florida were the two where they came up short, I believe. But again, this issue did not appear to have the kind of real stickiness in terms of convincing voters to turn out. It might not otherwise turn out as the Democratic organizers had hoped. And again, among younger voters, there seemed to be a greater interest in economic issues and an expressed frustration that they were not hearing from the Harris campaign the kinds of things that they wanted to hear about economic issues that would have more significantly motivated them to turn out and support Harris for president. So again, younger people who we have historically thought of as being ideologically oriented voters may be more interested now in economic issues as a result just of the way the economy has been acting in the last few years. some significant changes in terms of the composition of performance voters, meaning people that reliably vote for one party or the other. More men are becoming Republican voters, more women, Democratic voters. Suburban voters are trending to be more Democratic, where rural voters becoming significantly and almost monolithically Republican voters. Democrats losing a little bit of the support of Hispanics. Some initial indications show that Donald Trump may have gotten almost half of all of the Hispanic votes cast in the various states in this presidential contest. But North Carolina, it's 10% of our population is Hispanic, even though only 4% of our registered voters are. This may be a factor as we move forward and native-born Hispanic voters come online in North Carolina. If this trend continues, Republicans may see that as an increasingly important constituency to make sure that they're winning over in election cycles. And then looking at the support among African-American voters and younger voters, Republicans have made some gains since 2008 into 2020 that continued on in the 2024 election. So we'll have to continue to monitor this, but some changes and shifts in terms of who is the population within the voting segments that support candidates reliably of either the Democrat or Republican Party. And the question here is, North Carolina continues to grow. We expand our state's population by about 125,000 new residents, people moving into the state each year. A far greater diversity in the ethnic and racial composition of our state's population and voter segments. And so that will undoubtedly continue to be a new phenomena for North Carolina. All right, so taking all of those accounts, the thing that was interesting to me in the 7 battleground states that were considered to be seminal in the presidential contest, and Pennsylvania really proved it was shaping up to be the state that would make the difference. And Donald Trump winning Pennsylvania was in large part what cemented his success in this election. But the total difference between the votes for Donald Trump and Kamala Harris in those 7 states was only not even 1 million people. So if you think of it this way, not even 1 million people in this country decided, not even 3/4, just barely 3/4 of 1 million people decided who the next president of the United States would be. That's how competitive it is. And sort of the fact to keep in mind, in 1984, Ronald Reagan's reelection campaign, Reagan won 49 of the 50 states. We will never see again in our lifetime any presidential, in my opinion here, any presidential candidate do so significantly well across all of the states so as to win virtually every single state. We are a divided state and a divided nation in this way. And so I think we should expect, at least in the near term, presidential contests will remain very, very competitive as this one did. Some of the early exit polling that I saw, NBC News push this out. This is just North Carolinians leaving the polls. They're asked these questions. Interestingly enough, of the people that are consider themselves Democrats, a significant portion would identify themselves as of the people that identify themselves as liberal. Significant portion of them are Democrats, and the same true for people that describe themselves as conservatives. The moderates, slightly more Democrats than Republicans, probably some part of that historic sense of North Carolina politics where we had Democratic majorities for many, many years, but people were typically pretty conservative on an ideological basis. So a little bit of that probably remains in place. Abortion, a very strong, motivating public policy issue there. I think it's safe to say there are pretty significant divides along partisan lines. And again, what you saw is people that felt the economy was not good. There was a significant portion of people that were self-identified Democrats that agreed that the economy wasn't good. And that probably helped contribute to Donald Trump's success somewhat, where Democrats, self-identified Democrats, felt like the better option in the presidential race was Donald Trump if they were concerned about the current state of the economy. Their belief was that Trump would do better in terms of economic issues than Kamala Harris. And again, sort of reinforcing this with that age-old question, are you doing better now than you were 4 years ago? And the idea being that Kamala Harris was definitively tied to the Trump administration, having served as President Biden's vice president. Some sense that particularly, I think, issues around inflation, people felt by proxy, if nothing else, Kamala Harris was at least in part responsible for the same state of affairs in our economy as President Biden is in terms of people's perceptions. And again, not to belabor this too much, but I thought the one that was most interesting, the second one there, you can see of the self-identified Democrats, you could of the people that said they were voting against the other party's candidates, more Democrats than Republicans, I think that reflected a challenge in the Harris campaign, where a lot of base Democratic voters were very, very adamant in their opposition to Donald Trump, but it just wasn't a significant enough motivating factor. There wasn't the additional bit that those voters needed, believing Harris would be strong on issues that matter than principally economic issues. And that probably contributed a little bit to that result as well. And again, looking at the issues that motivated people, no surprises there. At the end of the day, and not to belabor it, it did seemingly come down to, as James Carville, the longtime political consultant who was famous for his work with Bill Clinton in his presidency, it's the economy, stupid. And I think that really was the factor voters were most focused on, was economic concerns. And in that regard, Trump just did better than Harris in giving people the sense that he would be the better option for the president. Okay, looking ahead, and again, glad to take any questions folks have. But the first order of business will be that Governor Stein will have to come up with appointments to the various cabinet agencies in the gubernatorial administration. Those now have to be approved by the state Senate. And so the first bit of interaction between the Democratic governor and the Republican-led General Assembly may be over that. If the Republicans want to be adamant in terms of not confirming cabinet secretaries that they feel they are not well suited or qualified to fill those offices, that kind of point of contention between a Democratic governor and Republican legislature might give us a glimpse into what to expect over the next couple of years in terms of how the two, the governor, the Democratic governor, and the Republican legislature get along. With some of the fundamental issues, we talked a little bit about this, but there is a little bit of a structural imbalance in the budget, sort of bubbling in the not too far off future. We're making some transitions away from the reliance on revenue from taxation and more on the revenue collected from things like sports betting, the other sources of revenue that are not typically as reliable in terms of the flow of cash into the state. That's got to be addressed at some point. There are a lot of ideological stressors within the two parties, and in some ways, of course, an incumbent president has a tendency to brand the political party. And so this is the party of Donald Trump, and it creates a certain dynamic within Republican Party politics, internal Republican Party politics in that regard. The Democratic Party, I think there's a real struggle on the farther left wing of the Democratic Party. There was a lot of pushback against Vice President Kamala Harris's conspicuous support from known Republicans like former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, former Republican Vice President Dick Cheney, Congresswoman Cheney's father, and other notable Republicans, some within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, expressing concern that it seemed like Kamala Harris was getting awful cozy with some of these Republicans. And so some part of this figuring out a way to build a coalition around issues that both parties can agree on is increasingly difficult to imagine. And people are just so divided within the two parties. Their willingness to work cooperatively and work together seems diminished enormously. And again, the state continues to grow and diversify. We have a lot of infrastructure issues we need to address. At this pace, we are likely to become the 8th and maybe the 7th most populous state in the country. We've got to keep up with the necessary roads and infrastructure, sewer and water, electrical generation and distribution. All of those things have to be tended to make sure we maintain a very favorable business climate and a quality of life for people in North Carolina. We have to focus on those things if we want to remain competitive in terms of attracting employers. And those are issues that you would hope Democrats and Republicans could agree on, if they can agree on anything. Of course, this election's over now, but what does this mean? Well, November 6th is just the first day of the 2026 midterm election. Historically, midterm elections go against the party in control of the White House. And so we'll see if that shapes up to be the case. It looks as though the financial markets have responded pretty favorably today to the what looks like the election of Donald Trump. Of course, it all has to be confirmed and satisfied and certified and all of that sort of stuff. But the markets are responding favorably, believing that a Trump administration would do the things that create a better business outlook, lowering taxes and regulatory burdens and those sorts of things that the financial markets have a tendency to be very supportive of. But if it does prove to be a Democratic wave election, just by the historical standards, that may change the landscape in North Carolina a little bit. All of our state Senate and state House seats are up every 2 years. So all of these current legislators will have to run for re-election in 2026. The current configuration on a partisan basis might shift if it's a significantly Democratic wave election, or we'll just have to see how things shape up as we get closer to 2026. Also in 2026, we did not have a U.S. Senate race on the ballot in North Carolina in 2024. Just the 2 6-year terms of our U.S. senators don't align, so that every now and then there's an election where neither one of them is up. But Thom Tillis, one of the incumbent, the senior senator from North Carolina, will be on the ballot again. And the question may be, does he face a Republican primary? He did last time he ran. And we'll see. Wiley Nichols, a current congressman, chose not to run for re-election to his congressional seat, but is pretty clearly gearing up to run for the U.S. Senate in 2026. So we'll see if he gets some Democratic opponents. If it looks like it's shaping up to be a wave election in the favor of Democrats, there might be a lot more Democratic candidates for the U.S. Senate race. Folks speculating that all they need to do is win their party's nomination as a Democrat. The Democratic wave will carry them in to the U.S. Senate. So a number of those issues will be shaping up over the next 4 years. One of the things that's not on the slides here, of course, with Steins having won in the governor's race, and a little bit of it, the consternation that the Republicans had about what happened to Mark Robinson in the revelations that came out that caused such a significant defeat, will be, is there some consensus around finding a candidate to be the Republican standard bearer in the governor's race in the reelection of 2028? Even now, getting started with that to try to avoid happening again, somebody who's only really recently come on the political landscape to be the Republican candidate for governor. There may be a far more concerted effort to try to get more longer term Republican politicians and elected officials to consider the candidacy for governor in 2028 and get them started now, and maybe in an effort to try to bring some consensus around one particular candidate who might be able to take on what we can all imagine would be Josh Stein's reelection campaign for governor in 2028. Okay, finally, just a word of thanks for those of you on the call that have been supportive of our Political Action Committee, IPAC. These are funds that we're able to use to support state candidates, state legislative and executive branch, such as Commissioner Causey. Your contribution to IPAC must be made with personal funds, and we know that's always a more significant ask, but state law limits Political Action Committee contributions to personal funds. There's a QR code there on the screen that will take you right to the online contribution page on our website, so you can make your IPAC contribution. Like, well, the election's over, why do I need to give? Well, like we said, the election season for 2026 already started. Politics is a little bit like the practice of painting the Golden Gate Bridge. It's such a long span that really getting done really only means it's time to get started again. And so we have made a significant number of PAC contributions in the course of this election cycle. The candidates that we supported were successful. We need to refill those coffers. It helps us strengthen and enhance the relationship we have with state legislators. Probably the most conspicuous and beneficial way that we demonstrate our support for candidates is the 5 of our own members who serve in the General Assembly will distribute the PAC checks to their colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, and it strengthens their relationship within the State House and State Senate, and that inures to our benefit as we look to advance legislation on your behalf that deal with regulatory and other issues associated with the independent insurance agency business model. And so your support of IPAC is a key part of what makes our advocacy strong and effective. And so if you are an IPAC contributor, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your support. If you're not, please consider before year end making a contribution. I will mention that for $120 contribution, you make a one-time contribution or monthly installments of $10 each. You can set all that up on the website. You get a lovely Yeti tumbler emblazoned with our PAC logo to let everybody know that you're a strong supporter of the IIANC Political Action Committee. And know that our PAC support for our own agent legislators is a big part of how we use those resources. We max out the maximum contribution permissible to a candidate is $6,400 per election cycle. So in the primary and in the general. And the Governmental Affairs Committee, as a practice, maxes out each cycle to our own agent legislators, an enormous way for us to show strong support for those agents serving in the General Assembly. That truly is the bulwark of our legislative effectiveness, is to have people that do for a living what you do, serving in the General Assembly, able to provide insights to their colleagues on the issues that impact insurance agents. They are the reason we've been so successful over the past several legislative sessions on a number of key issues that really have made a difference. The things that you have expressed as desires and wants and needs within the realm of changes to the statute have been in large part able to be affected as a result of our agent legislators serving in the General Assembly. So your PAC support supports someone who does what you do for a living, who's also serving in the General Assembly, helping affect the rules and regulations that impact the independent insurance agent community. And also a big shout out to my colleagues. These are the representatives of the association that are also supporters of our PAC. The fact that the staff is so supportive of the PAC, something I appreciate personally and significantly, that my colleagues are willing to put their hard-earned money behind our efforts to support legislative candidates, means a lot. So wanted to give them a shout out and appreciation for all that they do to keep our PAC strong. And with that, I am glad to answer any questions that there may be on any of the particular races or any other matters of politics or legislative activity or anything else.
I'm not seeing any questions, Joe. Couple of comments, though. You had a happy birthday.
Thank you very much. I will say this, November 6th is my birthday. And as you might imagine, throughout my professional career, working mostly in politics of one level or another, my birthday every other year has a tendency to be very close to Election Day. And there have been a number of times when my birthday actually fell on Election Day when I was working on a campaign. So celebrating my birthday, it's sort of like a kid born near Christmas. You get kind of overshadowed by the events, but it just seems fitting, given what I do for a living, that my birthday would be so close to Election Day. So thank you for everyone that offered birthday wishes. I appreciate that.
And then we had someone else thanking you for your balanced approach.
Well, thank you. And again, it's been my privilege and honor to represent the independent insurance agents of the General Assembly. We've had great success, as I've mentioned, on a number of key issues over the last couple of legislative cycles. We're gearing up for a long list of issues that we hope to tackle starting in January of 2025, coming back at trying to get a hands-free driving law done. We worked on this for a number of sessions now. There's been a hands-free bill introduced every session in the General Assembly since 2009, which predates my arrival here by almost a decade. But it's one of those issues where we're just going to have to be persistent and keep pushing. A little bit of points of resistance that we'll have to overcome. And I think we have the vast majority of legislators that see the necessity of a hands-free driving law. We just have to work through some of the points of resistance of legislators who are particularly able to hold back any bill of any sort that don't agree that a hands-free law is good for North Carolina. But we'll keep working it. With that, I think satisfied everybody's questions, and we can call it a day. Thank you so much. Keep your eyes peeled. The legislature comes back into session November 19th. There were a few budgetary issues that were not concluded successfully when the General Assembly was in session a few months back. A few gubernatorial veto overrides that they'll take while they still enjoy the supermajority, both House and Senate, and a few more disaster relief funding initiatives that are on the docket to be considered again once they come back in November 19th. So we'll push out information through the Raleigh report on that legislative session. And without further ado, if I don't see you between now and then, have a great Thanksgiving, a wonderful holiday season, and a very, very Merry Christmas.
Thanks, everyone.